movement. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to Egypt, where elections are underway to determine the country's first post-Mubarak government. Egypt's election commission says it will announce results from the first round of the three-stage parliamentary election later today. According to preliminary returns trickling in from Cairo, Alexandria, and 7 other regions, the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party seems set to emerge as the biggest winner. Some analysts estimate the group will capture about 40% of seats in the new legislature. Dr. Mohammed Mersi, leader of the group's Freedom and Justice Party, held a news conference on Tuesday in Cairo, saying the elections were proceeding well.
So far, the election process is going ahead in a very good atmosphere. The election process now allows Egyptian people to express their opinions with full freedom. The statistics for participation are very high, as I said, and are looking good. And there are still 5 hours to go until polls close. We believe that the numbers will rise for the second day, and the security situation is good.
For many first-time voters, the elections represented the essence of the Egyptian revolt that toppled longtime President Hosni Mubarak in February. However, some voters said the elections were not as free and fair as they could be.
There were obvious lawless actions, but as we reported these to the concerned authorities, such as the Higher Committee for Election, the armed forces or whoever, they did not respond.
Some protesters calling for an election boycott are carrying out a sit-in in front of the parliament and in Tahrir Square. Egypt's elections are taking place against the backdrop of renewed street clashes between pro-democracy demonstrators and security forces that have left more than 40 people dead and thousands injured. Now the Al Masri Al-Yum newspaper reports another protester injured during the clashes last week has died. Ahmed Badawi was 39 years old. He was wounded when a shotgun pellet penetrated his stomach and a rubber bullet hit his leg. Al-Masri said Badawi was previously injured during the protests against Mubarak on the 28th of January when he was hit by a diplomatic vehicle. There was widespread relief that the first round of polling involved little serious violence. Instead, a higher-than-expected turnout saw millions lining up to cast their ballots. Although it's too early to tell, there's been no evidence of the systematic vote rigging that became a hallmark of elections under the Mubarak regime. Well, for more on Egypt, we're very happy to have our very own Anjali Kamat back in studio. She flew in from Cairo last night, where she was wrapping up her year as Democracy Now!'s special correspondent. Today, Anjali is here not only to talk about what has happened in Egypt, but also her reporting on Libya during the fall of Gaddafi. And also, we will talk about her trip back home to India. Anjali, it's so great to see you again after almost a year when you first headed to India, which we'll talk about later. But then, as the protests erupted, you raced to Cairo, Egypt, where you've been for most of this year.
Yeah, that's right. It's very strange to be back in the United States. It's an exciting moment to be back, though, given all that's happening with the Occupy movements. As you mentioned, the elections, I think, are a very important possible game changer in what's happening in the transition period in Egypt over the past 9 months. What we've seen over the past 9 months is not, despite all the excitement that people had on February 11th when the former President Hosni Mubarak was toppled, you had a situation where the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, as it's popularly known in Egypt, became the ruling military council guiding the transition. And during this 9-month period, since February to now, criticism of SCAF has only been growing louder. Initially, I think people who were in Tahrir Square, people might remember one of the popular chants was that the army and the people are one hand. And there was a real sense of relief that the army said they would not fire on protesters and took the side of the people against Mubarak. But in this intervening period, I think a lot of that trust has been lost among a large number of people in Egypt. We've seen repeated sit-ins in the square. repeated negotiations between different political parties and SCAF about how much power is the ruling military council actually willing to cede. The council, which is U.S.-backed, which receives $1.3 billion in U.S. aid a year, has said repeatedly that it has no interest in holding on to power, but its actions have, led many to question how true this is. And most recently, just last week, right before I was planning to leave, I actually postponed my ticket because of this. There were violent clashes right around Tahrir Square and an enormous show of support in Tahrir. Last Tuesday, there were, there was a call for a 1 million-person march, and the square was full. People came out in very large numbers from across the city, and there were also protests in many other parts of the country, not just in Cairo. And while all these people were gathered in the square, there are violent clashes going on with security forces firing intense amounts of U.S.-made tear gas on protesters, and protesters fighting back with rocks and sometimes Molotov cocktails. My colleague Sharif, I know, has been on the show and talked about how Tahrir became like a giant field hospital. There were 14 small field hospitals set up, and 42 people died during this period. You mentioned today that the one protester just succumbed to his injuries, bringing up the number of the dead to 42, and about over 3,000 have been injured. And it's within this context that elections took place. So I think a lot of people were perhaps relieved that the violence came to an end and that there's been some sort of a return to peace and calm, and the elections did take place remarkably peacefully. There were no clashes reported, despite widespread fears of chaos and clashes. But I think some people, you mentioned that there's a small group of people boycotting the elections. There are a small group of activists who are very critical of holding the elections when the military council is still in power. But I think what we have now with the elections showing, at least this first phase of elections, a pretty decisive win for the Islamist political forces. That's political parties that use Islamic language, religious language to political ends. And this is a wide number of parties, but the largest is the Freedom and Justice Party, which is party of the Muslim Brotherhood that was banned for decades. And also the Salafist Noor Party had a very strong showing, which I think was a big surprise. And what you have from now on forward is, as the elections come to an end. And
the Salafists are even more conservative.
That's right, more conservative than the Muslim Brotherhood. More conservative branch of Islam. And what's interesting is, if you do have an Islamist-dominated parliament, what are the concessions they're going to try and win with SCAF? Because the political battle with SCAF is going to continue over the next few months. The one concession that people got from this week of clashes and sit-ins is that SCAF said that it would cede power and there would be presidential elections no later than July 2012, which previously there hadn't been a clear timeline, and it looked like it might even take until 2013 for there to be presidential elections. But they're still in discussions right now. They've appointed a new prime minister, Kamal Ganzouri, who was a former prime minister under Mubarak. And he is supposed to appoint a new cabinet. And already Freedom and Justice Party members, Muslim Brotherhood members, are saying that they want to have a role in selecting the new cabinet, the new government. So they're pushing SCAF on that. So it's going to be interesting to see, now that there's an elected representative, regardless of what its powers actually might be, how they'll push for more changes.
I wanted to ask you about the impact of the repression since the toppling of Mubarak. Your sense of what impact that may have had on the actual election results. 12,000 people jailed. Obviously, these were activists, political activists. Is there any sense whether who the military was targeting? Was it more liberal activists? Was it equally among Muslims of the Brotherhood, for example, or as well as liberals? And to what degree? Because, I mean, 12,000 people is a lot of people to take out of an election process. In essence, these would have been the organizers of voters. To what degree that has had an impact on these results?
I mean, I don't think there's been a direct impact on the results. Egypt is a country of 85 million people, and about half of those people are eligible voters. So 12,000.
Percent you figure voted?
I think the numbers that are coming out is between 30 and 40%. The ruling military council suggested a couple days ago that it was much higher, but most analysts seem to be sticking to the lower end of 30 to 40%. I mean, there was certainly the military trials of 12,000 people. Certainly created a lot of outrage. That's only increased over in recent months. And you know, one of the most famous cases is Michael Nabil, who's I think entering his 100th day of the hunger strike, and he was targeted for a comment he made on his blog and on Facebook. So a lot of those who've been targeted, which was saying the army and the people are not one hand, a post very critical of the military. And a lot of those who have been targeted are indeed bloggers, activists, liberal activists, some of them Islamist activists. But pretty much the sense is that it is difficult to openly criticize the military. People continue to do it, and in very large numbers, but there is a price to be paid for that.
We're going to break, then come back. Anjali Kamat, Democracy Now! Special correspondent, back from almost a year, where she has been covering the uprising and the post-revolution period in Cairo, Egypt, that continues to unfold. She returned from Cairo last night. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.